Well, thank you everyone for joining us and welcome to the UNC Core Center for Clinical Research Speaker Series. We're thankful that you took the time to join us, and I want to thank our speaker, who's no stranger to our group, Jamie Collins, who's an associate professor of orthopedic surgery and associate director of the Orthopedic and Arthritis Center for Outcomes Research. Today's talk is titled Machine Learning and Artificial Intelligence in Rheumatic Disease Research. So, Jamie, whenever you're ready, please go ahead.
Great. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I'm happy to be here. Um, and I will get started with just a few disclosures and sort of a disclaimer. As a disclaimer, I am a biostatistician, not a computer scientist. So like many of you, I'm trying to understand these sort of lightning fast advances in AI and how we can harness the power of these models and take advantage of and understand data in ways that we never could before, but also really understand its limitations and the ethical implications of its use. And so over the next 45 minutes or so, I hope to give a broad overview of these methods and how they're being used in rheumatology research. And so as an outline for today, I'll go through some definitions and concepts. So what is AI and how does it work? Go through a few practical examples in rheumatology research, talk about challenges in implementing AI-based solutions, particularly around privacy, biases, and trust, and then quickly touch on some future directions. And so starting with definitions and concepts, what is AI? What is artificial intelligence? And I thought, who better to ask this question to than ChatGPT? So here is how ChatGPT describes artificial intelligence. It's a field of computer science focused on creating systems or machines that can perform tasks requiring human-like intelligence. These tasks include problem solving, learning, perception, language, understanding, and decision-making. AI systems use algorithms and data to improve their performance over time, mimicking human cognitive function. And so sort of taking a step back, again, I'm a biostatistician. So if we think about the intersection of statistical modeling, machine learning, and AI, we think about statistical learning, we're thinking about mathematical formulas to understand the relationships between variables. We can kind of back it out from there, where machine learning is algorithms to find patterns and make predictions, and we can improve performance on specific tasks over time without being explicitly programmed. Finally, when we get to artificial intelligence, this is systems that can simulate human thinking, reasoning, and behavior. And so I think this is all a little bit obscure. And so I think we can think about this in the context of a classic classification problem. And this is kind of where AI sort of, I don't want to say got its start, but where it kind of got into the mainstream consciousness. And this is the old classification problem of dog versus cat. And so here we have Panda and Sylvie. How would we come up with an algorithm or sort of a statistical model to classify these photos as dog versus cat? In statistical learning, we would try to isolate features and put those into our regression model. So, what features would we measure here to put into our regression model? Both of these are very furry. They both have pointy ears. They both have whiskers. And so what are the features that we could extract from these to put into our logistic regression? And it's really sort of unclear when we think about that. But somehow we just know by looking at these pictures, our brain can figure out which one is the dog and which one is the cat, even though it's really difficult to even articulate exactly what leads us to that decision. So that when we say that, AI can mimic human thinking, what we mean is how can we sort of program an algorithm to differentiate between the two when it's difficult to really articulate the difference ourselves? How do we teach a machine to think like our brain is thinking when we look at these pictures and can tell which is a dog and which is a cat? So what do we mean when we say an algorithm? This is a set of rules or instructions that define a step-by-step process to solve a problem, make a decision, or perform a computation. And so we have inputs, we follow step-by-step instructions, and we get outputs. And so we can think of this sort of like a recipe. We start with ingredients, we follow the recipe, and we hopefully get a delicious cake at the end. As an example, something like the DAS-28, which is used to measure disease severity in rheumatoid arthritis. Our inputs are tender joint count, swollen joint count, global health, and C-reactive protein. We have a set of step-by-step instructions that we use to combine these inputs, and as an output, we get disease activity. So these are pretty simple algorithms. When we're thinking about AI, one of the things we think about are neural networks, and these are types of algorithms modeled on how the human brain functions. And these are really the foundation of deep learning. And so again, going back to our simple algorithm, we have our inputs, we combine them with an algorithm, and we get an output. But there's potentially a lot of information that gets lost by doing a sort of simple combination. And is there a way to get more out of this data? So we can think about kind of building this up. So building in more complex relationships between our inputs. So here we can start by adding two-way interactions. So we have, for example, an interaction between tender joint count and swollen joint count, an interaction between swollen joint count and general health. And by sort of combining these data in different ways, perhaps we can get a better or more accurate measure of disease activity. And in a statistical model, such as logistic regression, we really have to handpick whether we want these interactions, which interactions, quadratic terms, things like that we want to have in our model. We can include them, but that's what we mean by saying that these models need to be explicitly programmed. You can include all of these in a model, but you have to specify exactly what you want. So this is a figure from a recent paper in Arthritis and Rheumatology by McMaster and colleagues. This is a really great overview. It's artificial intelligence and deep learning for rheumatologists. And this is sort of showing a depiction of what a neural network is. The orange circles are the inputs. The blue circles represent the algorithm or the way that we combine these inputs together. And then the green circle is the output. The different ways that the inputs can be combined are shown here in sort of different types of networks, multi-layer perception, recurrent neural networks, and residual networks. But the idea for all of them is that we don't have to tell the model explicitly how to combine the data. The model uses the data and the output to find how to best combine the data to determine the outcome. And it does this through what's called backpropagation. So essentially trying to minimize a loss function or minimize the difference between the actual and the predicted outcome. And I won't get into the technical details here, but these networks allow for the inputs to be combined in very complex ways, as you can sort of discern from all of the different arrows here that are showing the association between all of those blue network nodes. And so deep learning refers to the number of layers or the depth in the algorithm. And this typically means greater than 3 layers. And so you can think of sort of a traditional regression model with no interactions would have just one layer, one regression equation that relates our inputs to our output. And in deep learning, we're building up those number of layers so that we can model these really complex relationships between our input variables. And these layers are sort of what allow the models to mimic human thinking. And the idea is that they're simulating the brain's neural networks, where information is processed through interconnected layers, which allow us to process these complex patterns like the dog versus cat image. You'll also notice this description here of hidden layers. And so when people talk about AI being a black box, this is what they're referring to. And I've often sort of seen people talk about neural networks or talk about AI and sort of literally draw a black box. You have input features, you put them into a black box, and you get an outcome. This is what we mean by that black box. We model really complex interconnected layers that relate our inputs to our output. But in doing so, we really start to lose the ability to explain exactly how the inputs come together to form the output. And so thinking back to that DAS-28, we know exactly how those inputs were combined to get the output. I mean, it's very clear right in that algorithm. How does tender joint count contribute to disease severity? As we start to build up these interconnected layers, the algorithm becomes more of this black box where it's impossible to say exactly how that input feature relates to predicting the outcome. One of the things that makes these deep neural networks so powerful is that they can handle what's called unstructured data. And so this is an example of structured data. As a statistician, this is what I work with. This is what I love to see when running an analysis. So we've separated out our inputs into these very tidy columns. And you can see it would be really easy to put this into a simple algorithm as we did before to compute disease severity. And so this is structured data. A lot of the time, though, our input data is not very tidy. And so this is an example from a paper published last year in Arthritis Care and Research that used data from the ACR's RISE registry. And they developed a natural language processing system to try to extract rheumatoid arthritis outcomes from clinical notes. And so if you've ever sort of reviewed clinical notes, taken clinical notes, done analysis on clinical notes, they can be very messy. Natural language processing, or NLP, is a type of artificial intelligence that uses this deep learning methodology to try to analyze text and language. And what we used to have to do, and what some of you probably have done, is have a medical student or a research assistant actually read through clinic notes to try to extract the data that we want. And that would sort of take the data from unstructured to structured. This is really a huge limitation in our ability to use data such as this, is that it required an enormous human effort to sort of go through and extract the pieces that we want. And so, why do we need a human or sort of human-like thinking to go from unstructured to structured? Why can't we sort of program a simple algorithm to do it? We have to really think about kind of the complexity of these data. And so here in blue are the data that we want to extract. So we're seeing, for example, that this patient A had a CDAI score of 11, had a MDHAQ function index of 0.7, and patient C had a CDAI score of 9. And so these are the pieces of data that we think are important. But there are also data here that we would not want to extract. So for example, on the top here for patient A, this CDAI interpretation 10.1 to 22.0 is actually showing the interpretation of the CDAI. So this is not a score for that patient, but what it's saying is this patient has a CDAI score of 11, which should be interpreted as moderate activity. And it would be really easy with a simple algorithm to sort of pull this out and think that this is actually the score that we want. Similarly, in patient B, there's a mistake in this note. The SDI is not scored out of 10, so it's sort of unclear what this is referring to. But again, a simple algorithm might sort of pull this out as the data that we want. So you can see from this example, why it needs human input or human-like thinking to try to process these data and to take it from this unstructured to structured setup. And so images are another example of unstructured data, and also an opportunity for me to show these very cute animals again. AI algorithms really excel at image assessment tasks. So we can think again about taking this unstructured data, these photos, to structured data. Can we extract features that would help us to classify these images? And AI algorithms work like the human brain. They work to almost read the image like a human would. And so, we can think about us sort of trying to extract features from this. So what would help us classify whether or not these are, a dog or a cat? Do they have pointy ears? Are they furry? Do they have a tail? The deep learning, or the AI algorithm, on the other hand, sort of reads through the image like a human would and extracts things like pixel patterns, the intensity, the color, spatial relationships, textures, etc., in order to do this classification task. So it's not sort of taking in these features that we can, sort of classify in terms of, the pointy ears, whether it's furry, whether it has a tail, but it's sort of reading through the image and extracting these things like the spatial relationships and pixel patterns in order to do the classification task. So much like the NLP example, a human does not have to assess these images and extract the features, but in taking in these unstructured data, that's part of the AI algorithm. Now, this is an illustration of a convolutional neural network. Again, I won't go through the technical detail, but it's meant to show how these networks really can go pixel by pixel through the image to extract details and model complex relationships. So again, as we're building up those layers, we can model the relationships between pixels that are close together, that are far apart from each other, etc. and to sort of go pixel by pixel through the image in order to predict an outcome. I think these two examples show why AI is so exciting and so powerful. These really used to be tasks that required an enormous amount of human input to first create the structured data from the unstructured data and then model the relationships between those features and the outcomes. And instead, these AI algorithms can take as inputs these unstructured data. If you're used to, working with statistical learning and statistical modeling, you're probably thinking that, this all sounds nice, but how do we create these complex models with lots and lots of layers without overfitting our data? And so we think here about training and testing. So training is the data that we use to develop the model, and testing is new unseen data that's used to test the performance of a model. So again, going back to our cat and dog classification example, we do training and testing so that we don't overfit. What do we mean by overfitting? We can think about how we might tell these two photos apart if we were to try to extract features. So the dog here has long fur, it's beige, it has dark brown eyes, and it weighs 50 pounds. And the cat has short fur, it's multicolored with light brown eyes, and it weighs 14 pounds. And so here's our inputs and our output. And then we want to use these inputs and output to sort of predict unseen data, what we think might be a dog or a cat. Well, in this case, we have a small black dog and a very furry brown cat. And using the data that we sort of developed on our training set, we would probably predict the picture in the upper left to be a cat and the picture on the lower right to be a dog. So we've really overfit here. We haven't really determined what separates dogs and cats sort of more generally, but we really fit to this specific case of Panda versus Sylvie. So including a large number of parameters and or a small number of observations in a model leads to overfitting. And so these complex AI models can be really prone to overfitting because we're modeling these really complex relationships with lots and lots and lots of input parameters. So how do we try to get around this when we're developing these models? So we typically start by labeling a subset of the data. So we tell the model which pictures are a cat and which are a dog. And then it learns sort of on this subset of data. There are often steps within this to try to mitigate overfitting in this training component, things like cross-validation, for example. So we develop our model in this sort of test data that's been labeled, and then we deploy the model in unseen data where we can assess its performance. There continue to be exciting advances in this field to try to make this process even more efficient. Semi-supervised learning, for example, is where part of the data set is labeled, and the model learns from both the labeled and unlabeled data. Reinforcement learning, I'll talk about a little bit more, but the model learns through rewards and penalties. So you think of something like a self-driving car, or even something like the Roomba, that automatic vacuum. The older models of the Roomba had to be programmed. So you had to tell it exactly where in your house you wanted that vacuum to go. But the newer models use AI technology to sort of learn good behaviors. If it keeps bumping into a wall, for example, or getting stuck in a corner or stuck under a table, it gets penalized for that and it learns not to go there anymore. And so this reinforcement learning is trying to teach these models to adapt to either avoid, bad actions or be rewarded for good actions. And so generative AI and large language models are also something that we talk a lot about. Generative AI is technology that can generate new content, things like speech, image, and text based on past training data. And large language models are a subset of generative AI that focus on text-based human-like content generation. These models take in a massive amount of data, and they're often first trained to learn a language, quote unquote. And by learning a language, we mean they predict missing words or generate the next word in a sentence. So we might train the model to predict what should be going into these blank spaces. That's how they're learning the language. And they're trained and tested to learn patterns. Similarly to what we saw on the last slide, we assess performance, and then things like reinforcement learning are used to give feedback to the model. And when these models are first being developed, this is often done with human feedback. So human reviewers rate model answers and output so the model can learn to provide better answers. And these models are constantly being updated and fine-tuned. If you've ever used ChatGPT, you may have seen this. You can give the answer a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or sometimes ChatGPT will give you two sets of answers and ask you to choose which one you prefer. When you do this, you're sort of participating in the reinforcement learning of these models. Another note is that it matters what goes into this initial training. And so how is the model learning language? How is the model learning what to predict in those blank spaces? This table is from a really nice overview of large language models published last year in the journal Rheumatology. And it shows a difference between Llama, which is Meta's large language models, and GPT-4, which is from OpenAI. So Llama is trained on a diverse range of texts, including scientific articles, while GPT-4 is trained on primarily internet-based text. And so, when you think about the text that these models are trained on, and then you think about the output that you get from them, depending on the context of use, one of these might be preferable to the other, and they're going to behave differently because they've been trained sort of on different inputs. So I'll go through a few practical examples, really at a high level, not getting into the detail of exactly how these are being used or sort of the technical details of the models, but really sort of a broader look at how AI is really transforming how we do a lot of research. And most of these examples are specific to osteoarthritis. So I think the area where AI made its really earliest and most significant contributions to rheumatology research is image assessment. We can, image assessment methods rely or used to rely on manual expert scoring. In osteoarthritis, for example, the Kellgren-Lawrence grade is used to assess disease severity of knee osteoarthritis. It's an ordinal 0 to 4 scale, ranging from no radiographic features of OA to severe OA. A weight-bearing X-ray is reviewed by a radiologist to determine the extent of osteophyte formation and joint space narrowing, and then that radiologist or sort of expert scorer gives it this grade. There's been a lot of effort in the field to develop algorithms that can assist with or even sort of do these gradings. In fact, in knee osteoarthritis, there's been so many models that have attempted to do this automated KL grading that there's actually been a systematic review and meta-analysis of 19 different published articles that have tried to apply deep learning to do this KL scoring. And so just, coming back to this structured and unstructured data, AI is really good at pattern recognition tasks, which include image assessment. And again, these sort of X-rays are an example of that unstructured data. We feed the X-ray in as an input, and we train an AI algorithm to output the KL grade. So here's an example from a study that developed an ensemble of convolutional neural network models to assess KL grade. The figure is showing a visual explanation of the predictions. So what was it about the X-ray that made the algorithm pick KL1 versus KL2, for example? So again, we're not inputting, osteophyte data or JSN data. We are inputting the image, the pixels in the image, and the algorithm is trying to predict which KL grade the knee should be. And so you can see as we move from the top row in KL1, possible osteophytes and no joint space narrowing, to the second row, which is KL2, which is definite osteophytes and possible joint space narrowing, that the algorithm is identifying areas on the medial and lateral margins as important sort of parts of this image that it's using to differentiate KL1 versus KL2 versus KL3. So again, we're not coding these features and feeding them in. The algorithm is telling us what parts of the image it used for the classification task. AI can do a lot more than just KL grading. There was a really nice paper published a couple of years ago now that describes a number of different ways that AI is really being used to kind of transform imaging, the whole imaging workflow. And this paper was specifically with an emphasis on MRI. So thinking about things like accelerated acquisition, image processing, and diagnosis and prognosis. AI is being used to accelerate MRI acquisition. And so MRI raw data, which is also called case-based data, is the raw signal captured by the MRI scanner during the imaging process. This encodes the spatial frequencies of the object and then needs to be converted to a readable image. This can be an incredibly time-consuming process. The MRI generates an enormous amount of data that then needs to go through really complex calculations, to create this readable image. It's estimated that in the osteoarthritis initiative, it took about an hour per knee in the MRI to get that scan. And so, as you know, an hour in the MRI is not cheap. And so it can be very prohibitive to have to do sort of this full MRI sequence. There are really exciting advancements that are being made in using AI for image reconstruction. And so, enabling, for example, the undersampling of that case-based data, essentially collecting fewer data points during the scan while still achieving the reconstruction of high quality, accurate images. There's really exciting advancements being made in image processing, particularly in tissue segmentation. In knee osteoarthritis, for example, measures of cartilage morphometry like volume and thickness are often used to study outcomes. And so here we're interested in extracting these features from the images. This used to be done with manual segmentation, where a human expert, a radiologist, or sort of other clinical expert would go to the image, every single image, and manually delineate the cartilage boundaries as shown here. This is obviously extremely time consuming. So never mind paying for an hour for the MRI scanner. Now you've got to have somebody go into each image and manually delineate the cartilage boundaries. Semi-automated and automated methods to do this task were really introduced as early as the 1990s, including methods like statistical shape models. But it's really been in the last 10 or maybe 15 years where artificial intelligence has made huge strides here. This is a recent example that used UNet, which is a type of convolutional neural network for the segmentation task. So the AI algorithm delineates those cartilage boundaries and then measures the volume and thickness. And the segmentation of the articular cartilage, including subregional assessment of volume and thickness, took just a few minutes per scan. And so in this example of tissue segmentation, what we're interested in getting as output are these features. So again, a measure of cartilage volume or a measure of our average thickness that, for example, could be used as an endpoint in a clinical trial. Another way that AI is sort of really innovative here is that it's being employed in analysis of OA diagnosis or prognosis, where the image itself is being used as the input. And I described the AI-based KL grading a few slides ago. There's been really exciting work in using images as input features to predict disease progression, for example. So we do have biomarkers in knee osteoarthritis. For example, the cartilage volume and cartilage thickness. I think I know as well as anyone that none of these have demonstrated really more than a modest ability to predict disease progression, particularly with respect to symptom progression. We know that OA is a heterogeneous disease. And so is there something that we're missing by using only these measured features as inputs in predicting disease progression rather than using the image themselves? And so there's just been really exciting work here at if we input the MRI sort of as the input and use these artificial intelligence models to try to predict outcome, are there things about the image that we haven't thought about before that might be important in predicting our outcomes? Another place where these models have really made strides, really in the last 10 years or so, is in gait biomechanics. People with knee osteoarthritis often exhibit altered movement patterns while walking, and aspects of these movement patterns have been shown to be associated with OA severity, pain, and risk of OA progression. Things like gait speed and stride length, knee adduction moment, flexion angle, and limb asymmetry. This is an example of a workflow for gait assessment. We have a participant in a gait lab. We place sensors on the study participant that track joint movements. Force plates might measure ground reaction forces and joint loading. So we have this person with all of these sensors on them. We have them walk through multiple gait cycles. And all of this data that gets collected gets distilled down to a few features of interest. So here on the far right, knee flexion angle at key gait phases is shown with those dots. So there's an enormous amount of data that's being collected here. And much like the imaging, the question is, in addition to features that have been shown to be associated with OA, such as that knee adduction moment and knee flexion angle, can we use sort of this breadth of data that's being collected to determine whether there might be other factors that may be important? Or by using the breadth of data collected without focusing on first extracting features, can we do a better job at predicting outcomes? And there's a lot of exciting work that's being done in this area. This is just one example from a recent paper showing the workflow to analyze the unique gait structure of an individual using artificial neural networks. So how can we use sort of all of this data that's been collected? And then again, in another analogy to sort of the imaging, much like how AI is being used to speed up MRI acquisition times and hopefully make that sort of a more cost-effective method, it's being used in biomechanics assessment to use less precise measurements of gait. And so, as I showed previously, historically, these assessments had to be done in a gait lab with specialized sensors and video equipment, much like the 1 hour MRI scan time. This is a big challenge, and many studies of gait biomechanics were necessarily quite small. There's a lot of exciting work being done to determine whether AI can be used to sort of recreate these gait measurements using less data or lower quality data. And this might allow for some of these assessments to be done outside of a gait lab, which would have major implications for feasibility. We use wearable technologies in OA research to measure physical activity, and these provide objective, continuous monitoring of movement patterns. These also capture an enormous amount of data. If that's not a theme here, it should be. A triaxial accelerometer, for example, measures movement in 3 axes. And so this might be the data that you get out from having somebody wear an accelerometer. We have a minute-by-minute reading of activity in 3 axes. And what we typically do with this is distill this down into summary measures. So for example, minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity, sedentary minutes, or total steps. The question is, again, can we use AI models, which handle these big data, to understand patterns in daily activity that we may be missing by using these sort of simple summary measures? And then switching gears a bit, I wanted to talk a little bit about how large language models are being used in sort of the intersection between research and clinical care. This is a study where authors asked how well a large language model does at answering questions from rheumatology patients. The authors took 30 common questions from patients. This was taken from an Ask the Rheumatologist section of the Alberta Rheumatology website. And these covered a broad range of topics, things like therapy, side effects, symptoms, drug coverage. And they took these 30 questions and entered them into the Microsoft Bing chat, which runs the latest generation of ChatGPT 4. So they had a set of answers that was supplied by ChatGPT, and then they had a set of answers that were supplied by MDs taken from that Alberta Rheumatology website. And they gave these two sets of answers to both a sample of patients and a sample of physicians without telling them which ones were AI generated and which were from that MD expert from the Alberta Rheumatology website. Then they asked both the patients and the physicians to rate their responses on comprehensiveness and readability, and physicians also rated the answers on accuracy. The results were that patients had no significant preference in comprehensiveness or readability, while physicians preferred those MD responses in terms of comprehensiveness, readability, and accuracy. Patients were able to identify 49% of the AI responses, so they were sort of equally likely to think that a response was AI generated versus MD generated, while physicians were able to identify 97% of the AI responses as such. So the conclusion of this study was that AI responses were found to be inferior to physician responses, which is at first a little bit counterintuitive because we were saying patients had no preference and patients were equally likely to think that a response was from AI or from an expert MD. So why is the conclusion that the AI responses were inferior? And this is a physician rating of those answers. And so the ratings of the AI-generated answers to the questions are in red. And then the blue is the physicians rating those MD-supplied answers from the Alberta Rheumatology website. And so if we take comprehensiveness, for example, on the far left and look at that pink, the physicians thought that the AI-generated answers had acceptable to good comprehensiveness. However, those MD supplied answers from that Alberta Rheumatology website, they thought had very good comprehensiveness. We also see a big difference in accuracy on the far right, where the AI answers were generated with sort of acceptable to good accuracy, but those sort of expert answers from the Alberta Rheumatology website were rated as very good. I think this raises some important questions about these methods. How do we validate them? Who should validate them? What is important to assess? And I think this study raised important questions, about thinking about the patient perspective. Can a patient really rate whether the response is accurate or not, or whether it's comprehensive or not? And thinking about, how do we all work together to make sure that we are using these methods responsibly and that sort of all key stakeholders are involved in developing and using these methods. And so that brings us to some challenges in implementing these AI-based solutions. So a big one is privacy and data security. AI requires massive amounts of data, often involving sensitive patient information. Medical records are highly confidential, and regulations such as HIPAA are meant to protect patient privacy. We need to carefully consider how data are being used and ensure compliance with any relevant regulations or laws governing its use. And I think, thinking back to that example of, wearable technology or the actigraph, even if a patient consents to our study, like they would in a study using an actigraph, do they really understand what they're consenting to and how their data will be used? It's one thing to calculate minutes of physical activity, minutes of sedentary time, but we can get a lot of personal information from these data. When do people get up in the morning? When do they go to bed? How much sleep do they get? Do they toss and turn at night? Does the participant really understand when they're consenting to these studies, what it is that they're sharing with us? And I also think that, many of these applications operate in kind of a gray area where patients may not give explicit informed consent for a particular AI model that's being developed. It's unethical to use a patient's data to train an AI model, for example, using electronic health data when the patient has not explicitly consented to that. Bias and fairness are a major concern, not just in AI in the healthcare setting, but more generally with AI. A model is only as good as its input data. Biases inherent to the input data will manifest in an AI model trained on that data. This has been particularly problematic with representation of racial and ethnic minority groups. For example, AI is really good at image assessment tasks, and models have been developed and implemented for diagnoses of skin diseases. And it's been found that these models do not work as well in darker skin patients. And so if we are only sort of inputting lighter skin patients into our model development, then when we sort of deploy that model, it will not work as well on data that it hasn't seen in darker skin patients. And so we really need to think about bias and fairness when we're developing and sort of implementing these methods. And I thought I'd share this anecdote from an article that was published in the Rheumatologist a couple of years ago. So I'll just sort of read this little piece. DALL-E Mini is AI software that creates totally new pictures based on what's learned from a gigantic database of images. When I typed in rheumatologist, I was excited to see that DALL-E Mini had generated 9 pictures of white coat clad rheumatologists palpitating various joints. But this excitement turned to worry as I realized that each blurry-faced virtual rheumatologist was, as far as I could tell, white and male. Even after resubmitting 5 times, not a single non-white or non-male rheumatologist showed up in the 45 images. This may seem like a sort of low-stakes example, but research has shown that large language models do demonstrate biases. This is a really interesting study assessing the potential of GPT-4 to perpetuate racial and gender biases in healthcare. And so in this study, they ran experiments using the Azure OpenAI, which runs the GPT-4, to determine whether responses demonstrated racial, ethnic, or gender biases. What they did was input case vignettes from the New England Journal of Medicine Healer, changing only the gender and race and ethnicity. So they would, for example, put in this case, a 36-year-old with a given race and given sex presents with an increasing frequency of unilateral throbbing headaches. And they would ask the GPT-4 to rank what the diagnoses might be. And they asked it to recommend, in addition to sort of ranking the diagnosis, recommend a list of next diagnostic steps and the list of treatment steps. So they would sort of put in the exact same case and say white female, black male, etc. So they examined the percent of time that GPT-4 referred a New England Journal of Medicine healer case for advanced imaging or referral to a specialist. Again, this is using the exact same wording for the case, only changing the race, ethnicity, or gender. And so in the green are cases where the black race was put into the description of the case, and in that red pinkish color are cases where white race was put into the description of the case. And so on the left is the percent of times that case was referred by GPT-4 for advanced imaging, and on the right is referral to a specialist. So you can see on the left, cases with black race, that's the green, were the least likely to be referred for follow-up imaging and the least likely to be referred for a specialist, and cases with white race were the most likely to be referred. Again, it's the exact same description put into the large language model with only race and gender changed. Our healthcare system is fraught with racial, ethnic, and gender biases, and we really have to think about how that data is being used to train these models. Our training data has biases that will be reflected in our AI models, and that is shown here. This brings us to the concept of trust in our AI models. We can think about the neural net that we looked at earlier this morning and how we kind of build up these layers. We start to lose the connection between our inputs and our outputs. How exactly are we getting from our input features to our predicted outcome? And again, a lot of times this is explained with the black box. We have our input features, we get our outcome, and we really have no idea what's going on in between. So why was GPT-4 less likely to recommend advanced imaging for those black cases? And it's sort of impossible to try to tease that apart. So it's really difficult to justify AI-driven recommendations when we do not understand why the model is making a particular recommendation. Without transparency, it's difficult to mitigate biases or to identify errors. Again, how do we mitigate that bias where GPT-4 is less likely to recommend advanced imaging for Black patients when we don't understand why it's doing it in the first place? And it also raises a really important question about accountability. Who is responsible for errors or adverse outcomes caused by AI recommendations? Is it the developers of the model? Is it the clinicians? Is it the healthcare institution? And also with transparency and trust is the idea of these hallucinations in large language models where they can present fabricated or false information. This is a really interesting study where the authors asked GPT-4 to write a letter for the off-label use of a medication and then asked it to provide references for this letter. They said, please list the respective literature sources, and ChatGPT said, sure, here they are. The authors did a literature search and found that these publications could not be found. So they asked ChatGPT, are these literature sources fake or do they exist? And ChatGPT says, no, they're not fake. Of course they exist. And so they asked again, these do not exist. Is this true? And finally, GPT-4 owns up. I apologize for the mistake. As an AI language model, I don't have direct access to the internet to verify the existence of specific literature sources. So this is, again, really important. This is a mathematical model. This is not a human. And so while AI can mimic human thinking, these are not humans. The algorithms are not trying to deceive us. Remember that these large language models are trained to predict the next word or phrase based on patterns in the training data. If it sees the sky is, for example, and then tries to predict what should come next. And each prediction is associated with some probability or confidence of what should be the next word. So the sky is blue. It can use context around those words. Don't forget your umbrella, the sky is cloudy. They don't know facts or understand concepts. They generate text based on statistical correlations they've learned in the training data. And so these models are going to make a prediction whether it has adequate information to do so or not. So what are some future directions around AI, particularly around research, and how do we work on some of these challenges? I really like this figure from a recent review that underscores these challenges and how we all need to work together. We need to ensure inclusive data practices and establish ethical standards. We need to engage and educate the community. I think that example of the physician versus AI generated responses to those common rheumatology questions is a really good one. How do we educate patients about, what they should be looking for? We need to be constantly monitoring how these models are being developed and how they're being used. A lot of work is being done in the area of explainable AI, which are methods that make the decisions and behavior of AI models more understandable and interpretable to humans. So really trying to unpack that black box. And this figure is from a recent review on the topic and how we need to be centering ideas like model interpretability and clinical plausibility. This is a really active area of research, and developers and healthcare providers alike realize that we need trust and transparency if we're going to deploy these models in clinical care. AI developers and end users need to work together to make sure we can understand and trust what we're getting out of these models. And so in terms of future directions, we talked a lot about imaging, wearable technologies, other areas, drug development and repurposing, personalized medicine, genetics and epigenetics. Again, thinking of all of this big data that's out there, where we've sort of distilled things down into those features. We take an MRI and we get cartilage thickness. We take 24 hours of continuous actigraph use and we get minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity. How can we sort of make better use out of all of this big data that we're collecting? So really, the sky is the limit. So just some concluding remarks. AI offers exciting opportunities to gather, process, and analyze data on a scale that's really never been possible before. Again, the reason 30 years ago we were doing manual segmentation of MRI is because that was really the only way. This technology aims to improve patient care, clinical efficiency, and clinical workflows. We need to acknowledge limitations and continue to work for solutions. And collaboration is really key, particularly between AI developers and healthcare professionals. So people developing models and sort of people using these models. And also thinking about the patient voice, everywhere from that data collection and how data is being used all the way through to how the models are being deployed. I'd like to end with this quote from Professor Kareem Lakini at Harvard Business School, who says that AI won't replace humans, but humans with AI will replace humans without AI. I think AI is here to stay, and we have to work to harness its potential to improve patient care and drive research breakthroughs. But equally important is knowing enough about AI so that we can understand its limitations, ensure its use is ethical and effective, and really helps to improve the lives of people with rheumatic disease. Here are a few key references. And I also did just want to point out at the upcoming OrSay World Congress, if you'll be attending, there'll be a pre-Congress workshop on the art of artificial intelligence in OA. I'm not involved in this workshop, but I think it looks very exciting. In particular, Carrie Costello is a researcher at the University of Florida who's doing lots of exciting work, sort of in AI and biomechanics. And then what I didn't get to touch on today, which is also something that I think is going to be a big challenge for all of us in the research community, is AI in publishing. And so the editors-in-chief of Osteoarthritis and Cartilage will be speaking about that. So I think this will be a really interesting session. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention. Thanks to my research team here at the Orthopedic and Arthritis Center for Outcomes Research, and thanks to my funding from NIAMS.
Great. Thank you so much, Jamie, for that very excellent presentation and sharing that information with us. We do have about 10 minutes for questions, so I welcome you to unmute yourselves and ask those questions or place something in the chat. But I'd like to kick us off if I could and just ask a question about sample size types of considerations and how you can get a rough sense of whether you have a sufficient amount of data to be able to use these methods, or what kind of guidelines you might recommend in terms of various types of artificial intelligence types of methods, and feeling confident that you have a sufficient sample size.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think probably an area where we need more research. I think, as statisticians, we're so used to, even just rules of thumb of how much data we need, how do we avoid overfitting. And I'm not sure that I've seen things like to do a deep neural network, you need 20,000 observations. I've seen 10,000. I just don't think that that has really been established. What I do think is important is, having enough data for that holdout testing data set. I think when we're thinking about statistical modeling, um, the idea of doing sort of a separate training and testing data set in the last 10 years or so has really fallen out of favor, with the idea that if you say hold out 20% of your data, you train your model at 80% and test it in that 20%, there's a chance that when you did that 80-20 split, you sort of got a unrandom whatever sort of sample in that 20%. And so there's been a lot of people pushing back on that and saying that we should be doing things like bootstrapping, like cross-validation, that those are kind of better methods for validation than doing a holdout sample. That's not the case when we talk about these AI models, because the risk of overfitting is so high. You have to have enough in your testing data set to truly test your predictions. And so again, I don't know that there's really been much established there, but I think we're talking about thousands of observations, depending on how deep you're really building that network.
So, this is Ali Garmazi. I have a question. Can I just go
Yeah,
ahead?
please.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, Jamie. I do think the best slides of the whole talk is about an AI model is good enough when you train them the right way. I'm paraphrasing, by the way. And when I see actually your image, that one that has actually some color on it about the cardinal Lawrence, I got actually to jump here because almost every single cardinal Lawrence is maybe one, except one or two, are right. The rest is completely insanely not cardinal Lawrence, neither two, neither three, and I can go through those images one by one. I don't have time to write a letter to the editor again because I'm fed up with this. But that's the problem. This is exactly, it goes actually to Ted Schwartz's actually question, all right, about how to train, how to get actually this done the right way, etc. It's very problematic. I do think in an era where everybody wanna write something, where everybody thinks that they can be a substitute to radiologists, to cardiologists, to neurologists, etc. I do think we should be very extremely careful with what we are doing. And that's actually a typical of how you really get AI to do mistakes, because AI is a machine, right? If I'm training the machine, telling her that carbon lawrence 4 bone on bone is 0, it's going to do the same thing. And this is very problematic, all right? So I do think there is actually a paper that we publish in radiology, which is as you know, the Journal for Radiologists. Maybe some of you don't know. It's about the AI in MSK and what is actually the future of it. And we actually put there many problems that are facing right now. So we have of course some words of wisdom, some words of saying yes, AI is going to help. Absolutely, 100%. I'm actually a guy that think that as a radiologist, I'm going to be better doing with AI than without AI. So, and AI and radiologists, they're going to replace radiologists without AI. That's for sure, 100%. So I'm not scared about AI, but at the same time, I do think AI has to be trained the right way. Otherwise, we're going to run in catastrophic events, to be honest. And we're talking here research, but let's talk about patients, right? When you have a patient and you tell him you don't have this, and the patient has it, what are we going to just say after that, right?
Yeah, I think you're raising really important points about the quality of the training data. And so one of the things, particularly with the Kellgren-Lawrence grading that has been so problematic is who is doing those Kellgren-Lawrence gradings, right? If your quote unquote gold standard isn't any good, if your training data isn't any good, then how is your AI model going to be any good? And with Kellgren-Lawrence in particular, it's been shown to have really sort of modest inter and intra-rater reliability, kappa scores around 0.7. So even people doing these Kellgren-Lawrence gradings don't always agree with each other. And so it's a really big question, I think, particularly around imaging. If the people doing sort of that gold standard that's using are being used to train the models don't agree with each other, how are we going to get anything out of those AI models? And I think Ali raises a really good point that I think it's very easy with all of this big data accessible to say, okay, I have these KL gradings, I have my deep convolutional neural network, I'm going to come up with a model to predict them. But unless you understand what those outputs are and sort of how good or not good those gold standards are, it's really difficult to understand whether your model is useful or not. And so I think there is a real danger here with that quality of the training data, and the accessibility of all of these algorithms. I mean, I think if any of you have, students who are in college, even high school, they can probably run some of these models, right? They're all learning Python. And so you have somebody sort of just plugging stuff in and getting an output. And I think that's a really big concern.
Jeffrey, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much, Jamie, for this presentation. It was really good to see this all consolidated and brought together. I think I share your perspective that AI is a pretty remarkable tool, and if we learn to wield it appropriately and correctly, it's kind of shaping the future. So I wanted to mention some of the, maybe call it like hand wringing, that AI experts have over AGI, kind of generally speaking. I won't say that I fully understand like at a technical level, the real concern with AGI, but maybe suffice it to say emergent phenomena that, maybe people don't understand the nature of, is of concern. So I wanted to ask whether well, I wanted to ask what in sort of our field, in kind of medical image processing and disease diagnosis, with advancements of AI and with continued development of AGI, what would you say are maybe the biggest concerns kind of in our field? Maybe around emergent phenomena or disease classification or that kind of thing.
Sorry, what was the second part of that question?
So the question is around, what are concerns kind of specifically in our field? So in, medical image processing and disease characterization, you know, specifically around, I guess, AGI or continued development of AI. Do you have some ideas of what are some big concerns and how to head those off?
Yeah, I think like Ali just raised, sort of the quality of the training data is a really big one, in terms of, if we don't have a ground truth, how do you validate any model? And so that's something I think that's a major concern. And I think, the idea of kind of biases, it's not as evident. Certainly a model that, for example, is trained on mostly lighter skin tones that's meant to diagnose skin disease and then is deployed in darker skin tones, it doesn't work as well. That seems sort of intuitive in a way. We think about a lot of this training is in data sets like the OAI, like most, that are overwhelmingly sort of white people of European descent. What are the biases in that? Even in our healthcare systems, who are the types of people who are getting MRIs? If you wanted to use sort of MRIs or X-rays from your own institutions. So again, thinking about like what is going into those training data sets. And again, it is so easy. These tools are so readily available. It's so easy to just sort of say, okay, we have this group of images and we're going to use it to try to predict an outcome, or we're going to try to diagnose disease, without really thinking about where those data came from. And, for those of us who do a lot of observational research, thinking about things like that strobe checklist, right? Where you have to say exactly who got into your cohort and how, who's in and who's been excluded, what are the potential selection biases, things like that. I think as statisticians, epidemiologists, we're all sort of trained to think that way. And I worry about the sort of availability of data and availability of methods that people who aren't thinking that way are sort of just plugging this information into algorithms. And it's really unclear who's being included and who is being excluded and who these results might generalize to.
Great. Well, thank you all. We're a bit over time, but again, Jamie, thank you for that very excellent presentation and for sharing your insights. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we will archive this and make it available shortly. So take care, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks again.
Thank you.